My name is Dan Graboy, and you are watching the $2 Room podcast. I'm talking with Andrea Mason today. Hi, Andrea.
Hello,
You are the chair of kinesiology at UW-Madison.
I am, yes.
Let's start by having you tell us what is kinesiology.
So, kinesiology is the study of human movement. And we actually look at human movement across all levels of study. So, from the cellular level all the way to population level. So, it's really, really broad discipline.
You anticipated my next question, which was, do you get into the biology of all of this? Or are you thinking more in macro terms? You're doing both. Can you describe what you in particular like to look at and study?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in how people use what they see, what they feel, what they hear in the environment to plan and perform movements. So I'm particularly interested in two types of movements. I really like understanding, I think, more complex coordinated movements. So how do we reach with our two hands in a coordinated way to perform tasks? So you can think about a drummer, for example, reaching out to pick up their two drumsticks. And if those two drumsticks are located in places that, they can't look at both of them at the same time, how do they figure out where to look and when to look in order to do those two tasks, um, correctly and simultaneously? So that's one type of movement that I like looking at. And then the other type of movement that I'm interested in is more whole body coordination. So when we're walking, how do we coordinate the movement of our lower body with some of the tasks that we might want to do with our upper body, like, walking and reaching out to grab your water bottle as you're, leaving the house in the morning.
That's fascinating. It strikes me that we probably differ from a lot of animals in that our body movements can be conscious or not. So I can think about picking up a pencil in my hand, but if I need a pencil, I might not even think of it and up it goes.
Mhm.
So is there work done on the difference between consciously propelled movement versus not?
Yeah. Yeah, and that happens a lot in what we call motor learning. And so there's a theory in motor learning that says that when we first start performing a task, so you can think about, when you were a baby. I know you probably can't remember that, but if you've watched your own child, learning to do tasks, you can see that when they first start doing tasks, they're really having to think about it. And according to this theory, this is called the cognitive stage, right? So you're thinking about every step of the movement. But as we practice skills more and more and more, they start transitioning from cognitive to essentially automatic, where we don't have to think about them anymore. And the nice thing about that automatic stage of performance is that it gives us the freedom then to do other things, right? So when we think about, the multitasking, dual tasking that a lot of people try to do successfully,
And fail.
That's happening if it's happening successfully at all in the automatic stage, right? The autonomous stage is what it's called, where you're not having to think anymore about performing that skill. It just happens automatically.
Would you say that our consciousness can interfere with the perfection of our body movement?
Yes, yes. And if you're familiar with the phenomenon in sports, and actually it probably happens in music as well, choking under pressure, you've probably heard that term, right?
Happens all the time in music.
Right, right, where you get on the stage and all of a sudden there's all that pressure. And this is a skill you know really well, and you've practiced that piece hundreds, if not thousands of times, and then in that moment you can't do it anymore. The thought there is that what's happened is this skill that has moved from this conscious performance to a more automatic performance actually reverts back to conscious performance. So you start overthinking it. And it's that overthinking process, the trying to perform something that should be automatic, more cognitively, that that's what causes people to choke. So
So
yes, it can definitely interfere, right? It can definitely interfere. And it usually
so
happens in these really high pressure situations.
we call that paralysis by analysis, which is
Right, exactly.
right.
Yeah.
So, and this happens a lot. And actually, my instrument, French horn, is a great example because it requires a fine and delicate level of accuracy when you're trying to play a note, especially if it's high. The neighboring notes are very close by. So, if you would imagine a piano key that's 2 millimeters wide instead of, three-quarters of an inch wide, it's much harder to hit that key. That's what it's like playing the horn in the high register. And so people often do, in fact, start at a concert thinking, I better hit this note correctly. That means I have to do this and this and this. So, as teachers struggle with coming up with strategies not to do that. And as you know, once you say don't do something, you're thinking already about doing it. So, has your field come up with solutions to the problem?
Ah, that's really interesting. I think anything that people can do to relax. So, you know, that warm up routine, having the routine just in general that gets you more into a relaxed state, can benefit that performance. So I think that's probably the best way to think about it is to really, have that routine that helps you to feel like you've got it under control.
You were talking before about babies and how they learn, and you said, I'm not going to remember the exact quote, but you said at the beginning they're thinking about what they do.
Yeah.
But infants don't think in words
Right.
because they don't have words.
Right.
So, what do you mean when you say an infant is thinking about picking up a sippy cup?
Right. I mean, everything that we do requires some level of thinking. And I like to think about babies as like really amazing scientists because they're doing experiments all the time. And so when we think about, reaching out to pick up that, well, think about a baby just in general, when before they can reach out and pick up something. And actually reaching is one of the movements that develops pretty early in babies, right? Um, but just that those initial flinging movements that they're making with their arms, right? So it looks like they're completely random. They're flinging their arm out, and they're looking at where their arm goes, right? So they program a movement, they execute that movement, and then they look at what the result is, and they feel what the result is, and that gives them a data point, so they can say, oh, when I programmed that movement, this is where my arm went. That's what it felt like. That's what it looked like. I've got this data point. I'm going to try now another program, and my arm's going to end up somewhere different. And that gives me another data point. And then, with all of those data points through time and practice, eventually they have a rule. And that rule is a rule that they can use to say, I want my arm to end up in this specific spot. With all of those data points that I've accumulated over time, I know now what the program needs to be to get my arm to that point.
There's an amazing book, and it's called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki. It's a book that I would talk about a lot about in lessons with horn students. And the idea is that the first time you do something, let's say you've never seen tennis and someone hands you a racket and a ball, and you look at it and you figure that you're going to smack the ball with the racket, the strings of the racket. That's not a hard inference to make. And you have freedom because you have no technique.
Mhm.
So you have no guidelines, nothing you are trying to achieve in particular. You are the kind of experimenter that a baby is. And the purpose, according to this book, the purpose of Zen meditation is to get back to that state of what he calls beginner's mind.
Mm.
and which I think is a really powerful concept. And when you were talking about babies doing these science experiments, it struck me that while you were speaking in science rather than poetry, you were describing something extremely poetic, which is what is freedom?
Right.
Babies do not have constraints. Now we have constraints because we have to dress ourselves in a particular way. We have to present ourselves in a particular way. We can't be flailing about and seeing what happens because we have society. So, are there ways in which humans have adapted to the fact that we think about things and are constrained? And is there a such thing as free movement after the baby stage, or is there some way to recover a physical sense of freedom that we lose as soon as we gain our consciousness? And our words are probably a constraint as well. It may be that babies' thinking is just way more fluid because they don't have words. So that's a huge pile of rubble for you to start digging through.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really interesting question. Like the freedom to do anything with your body. Yeah, I think that does exist in some of our forms of art, right? So if you think about dance, for example, I mean, that's freedom of movement, particularly some, very specific types of dance, modern dance, and where they're, a lot more flowing in their movements. I think that, when we have very specific goals that we are trying to achieve with our movements, like picking up a cup in order to bring it to our mouth, we could choose a whole bunch of different ways to get our arm from where it starts to the location of that cup, right? We're really not constrained to do it the most efficient way. We could, put our arm over our heads and, come from the top to pick it up if we wanted to. But I think we tend to choose efficiency, right? We choose efficiency. So, when I was studying how people perform these bimanual tasks or even just a simple reach and grasp task, which I did for many, many years, most people choose the same type of movement, right? We're very consistent across people in the way that we perform that particular movement, and that's because it's the most efficient. And we've probably learned over time how to do it in the most efficient way. If we, look at the baby, it may not choose the most efficient way, but over time we've learned that, and I think that that is a constraint that we use because we want to minimize the amount of energy that we are expending as we are performing skills.
So now I'm looking out the window and noticing the paved road that I live on. We have flattened our terrain. And I guess we've provided efficiency that way. So when I cross the street, I don't trip on a rock or a root because we flattened that. And it seems like we've rendered our environment extraordinarily efficient.
Mm.
I guess my question is there some loss incurred in so doing to us as a human animal?
I mean, probably, I think we probably made the decision to pave that road, not for us as humans using that road, but for all the vehicles that use the road, right? Probably, I mean, variety in the kinds of movements that we make certainly allows us to adapt and adjust to situations that we haven't experienced before a lot more easily. So as we've made our environments a lot more consistent, that reduces the amount of variability that we have in the kind of movements that we make. So maybe we've lost something in that sense. I think a lot of us still like to get out into nature though, right? And as we're doing that, we're dealing with terrain that isn't paved over. Um, so that reintroduces some of that variability into our movements.
Is there some kind of natural state of humans to which we ought to aspire through our movement?
Natural state.
In other words, we evolved in nature, although we probably started altering it very early, as many animals do, of course. I mean, a bird builds a nest.
Yeah.
Is there is there an Eden out there in which our bodies could function much better and our lives feel less constrained? Or do we, I guess I'm asking more of a philosophical question, which is maybe inappropriate.
I think that movement in general, I mean, there's, of course, motor control, people think movement is really important. But there is a sort of belief out there that our brains exist for movement, right? That's why we have brains, is so that we can move. And so I think just continuing to move is the big thing. And that's important for our brains, but it's also important for our bodies in general, like our physiology. I think we've become very sedentary. Well, I know we've become very sedentary, right? Most of us sit at our computers for hours on end or sit down and scroll on our cell phones, and we're not moving nearly enough. And that movement actually, it feeds our brains, it feeds our souls. So I would say the natural state is movement in general, any kind of movement.
I want to come back to that in a minute, but first, before I forget, you talked when you were talking about modern dance and bodies flowing. So I know in music and in sports and probably lots of other realms, it is very fashionable now to talk about a flow state.
Hmm.
So that flow state is one where you're not thinking about it, it's just happening. If you're a musician, it feels like you're not even trying.
Yeah.
There's another really interesting book for musicians about called Effortless Mastery, which is all about how to not try strategies for reducing effort. So, does your field have a deep understanding of flow state and maybe some suggestions for how to get there? It strikes me that that could apply to stock traders and farmers and name your profession, emergency room doctors. Um, what is going on in flow state? How do we get there? Yeah, there's another pile of rubble for you.
Yeah, like I would say in my specific discipline, flow is probably not a concept that we use in the science that I do. But definitely, I sort of equate the idea of flow with getting to that level of automaticity where you don't have to think about the skill anymore. I also equate flow with almost like enjoyment, right? You're getting to a point where that task is just deeply enjoyable to you, and that can only come with a lot of practice, right? Going from the part of performing the task that is takes a lot of effort to that part where it's really effortless because you don't have to think about it anymore. So I guess, if I was thinking about how we would apply flow in my discipline, it would really be once you get to that level of automaticity and you compare that with some of the other aspects of the task that you can't really do until it's automatic. So in music, that might be, if you're working really hard to figure out how to get your finger to the right place at the right time, that requires a lot of cognitive effort. It's really hard for you to think about how do I make this sound beautiful? And it's only when that task becomes really automatic that you can do that, and then that enjoyment of the music can happen. So I guess I don't know if that really answered your question, but that's kind of the way I think about flow is, when the task doesn't require the cognitive effort and you can just enjoy it because it's automatic.
This is reminding me of Malcolm Gladwell talking about writing about 10,000 hours required. Is that an invented number? Does your field talk about this? Obviously, repetition rote is the soul of physical learning. Unfortunately, rote seems to be kind of a dirty word these days in learning. But why don't you talk about all of that?
I mean, 10,000 hours is, yeah, it's a made up number. I mean, everything's going to depend on the task that you're learning, right? Some tasks are not going to require 10,000 hours to master, and other tasks are going to require more than 10,000 hours to master. And some tasks may never be mastered, right? So I think it is a made up number. Um, Hours are also not important if they're not the right kind of hours, right? So we can do a lot of practice that's really counterproductive if we're not doing it correctly. So there are all sorts of theories in motor learning that talk about the right kind of practice. So, do you have variability in your practice? Are you distributing your practice in a way that you're not trying to mass it all together and do these really long practice sessions without any breaks? Rest is really important. The ability to consolidate information, that requires sleep. So are you sleeping enough, right? There's all sorts of things that we need to do in order to learn, and there are ways to set up practices to optimize that. And those depend way less on the number of hours and more on how you've set up that practice session.
So I remember when my son was starting to play the piano and I brought him to a lesson. He was a very, very young kid. And his teacher told him, okay, now you can practice this. And I thought, what does that mean to a kid? Practice this. I mean, and now I'm a 62-year-old musician I've been playing for 52 years, and I feel like I still struggle with how to practice. Um, which is why books like Effortless Mastery are very helpful to musicians because we all know we're supposed to practice, but this stuff that you're talking about, I think, is so crucial. Like you need to take a break. You need to not just do one thing for an hour, but mix it up. So, can you describe for a young athlete or musician or anybody doing a physical task some of the guidelines that you would propose for them to improve more efficiently?
Mhm. So there's lots of things that we can draw on here. So I would say one of the really interesting things, and I noticed this about my daughter's piano teacher, and she was not an expert in motor learning, but she was a phenomenal and continues to be a phenomenal piano teacher, is this idea of primacy and recency in memory. So one of the things that you can do to help your memory for the things that you're trying to learn is to start and end your practice session with new things. So things that you haven't practiced before. And then the things that you're sort of reviewing, you would have in the middle of your practice session. Because there's research to suggest that the things that we do first in a practice session and the things that we do last in a practice session are going to be remembered best. So
Do you
it's
know
best.
why?
What's that?
Do you know why that's the case?
Probably it's an attention, right? It's that's where you have the most attention at the beginning and the end. And so if you can start and end your practice sessions with things that you don't know as well, you're going to be able to remember those better. And the things that you already have a little bit of knowledge about, you can kind of review those in the middle. So that's one thing that you can do pretty easily in your practice session. So start with the hard stuff and end with the hard stuff, right? The things that are more attention demanding. Variability of practice. So don't take a passage from a piece and practice that 10 times in a row and never come back to it in your practice session. Instead, practice it maybe twice and then do something different for a little while and then come back to it. That's called variability of practice. And actually, the term that we use for that is contextual interference. So, contextual interference is essentially the interference that happens when you're varying your practice. So, if I practice one passage, and then right after I practice something different, those two things are going to interfere with each other. And that's good because in order to learn, you have to have your brain has to work, right? But if you practice the same passage 10 times in a row, by the time you get to the fifth, sixth, seventh time, your brain's not working anymore. It's just repeating. It's doing the rote thing that you were talking about, right? It's not working anymore. And we learn best when our brain is working. So variability of practice is really good. The rest, the breaks that I talked about, so that's called distributed practice. So taking some breaks and not just, if you can do 15, 20-minute bites, right? And then take a break and then come back and do it again. Um, that is going to lead to better learning. Trying to think of other concepts
It
that would.
doesn't have to be music focused either. I mean, let's talk about basketball or math or anything.
Yeah, I mean, the concepts apply across all of learning, which is really interesting, right? Motor skills are really no different than cognitive skills. So when we think about what's best for um, learning a physical skill, it's going to be the same thing that's the best for learning math. So variability of practice, the primacy recency, so the hard things first and last, taking breaks, let's see, sleeping on it, right? So allowing your brain to actually replay all of that work that you did. So that's what people think is happening during consolidation, which is what happens when you sleep. Is that your brain kind of replays all of the things that you experienced during the day. And so that's really, really important for learning.
Can you get into sleep a little deeper?
So I mean, there's just a lot of research that suggests that if you learn something in the morning and then try to recall it in the evening, it's not going to be quite as good as if you learn it in the evening, sleep, and then try to recall it in the morning. So that sleep, that ability to replay during our REM sleep is really, really important for the brain to essentially, um, strengthen those neural connections that lead to memory, right? So as we're replaying those things that we experienced during the day while we're sleeping, those neural connections are getting stronger and stronger and stronger.
So it sounds like from all of this, when we're learning a new activity, let's say we're learning to throw a javelin, we want to be in the Olympics. Some of that learning is this physical training to be able to do something automatically. Um, so part of it is about emptying our head. Part of it is about a lot of repetition, but part of it is about giving space between those repetitions.
Mhm.
Am I describing this correctly?
Yeah, yeah, and doing the right kind of repetitions, right?
Okay,
So
what is the wrong kind of repetition and what is the right kind?
the same thing over and over and over again. So if we get back to our basketball player, you talked about basketball. If that basketball player said, I want to get really, really good at free throws. That's really important to me. I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to throw 500 free throws, right? That's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to do that every day. By the end, I'm going to be great at free throws. That's not as good as if, even though the person really just wants to learn how to throw free throws, it's not as good as if they went and, did 100 free throws and also did some layups and some jump shots and some other types of shots, right? And mixed those in. That's way better, even if you're just trying to learn how to shoot free throws. When I talked about very early on in our conversation, when I talked about the baby and how the baby is, putting its arm out over here and, looking at where that goes, and that's a data point. And then they're doing this and they're getting that next data point. That's kind of what you're doing when you're learning this new skill, right? You've got a data point for free throws, but if all you do is practice free throws over and over and over again, you've got a very limited set of data points, and it's hard to create that really strong rule that will allow you to take shots. But if you have a whole bunch of different types of shots, you've got a lot of data points, and that's going to give you a better rule.
This strikes me as running completely against our image of the great athlete, the great artist, the piano player who spends 10 hours a day playing scales and playing etudes, and the basketball player who does the 500 free throws a day. Um, Maybe society needs to rethink how, well, I don't know, the notion of how we learn in order to accommodate the research that people like you are doing. I don't know how it gets out there from, uh, the hallowed halls of academia and makes its way into the public because what's made its way in is 10,000 hours
Right.
and like painting frantically and then tearing it up and painting another one. And yeah, I don't know how this change comes about. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that some of it is making it into, pedagogy books for music teachers and for coaches. I think some of it, as I've talked to my students, I've been teaching motor control and learning for 25 years. And I think when I first started, I would ask people, hey, when you did your basketball practice, did you do all of your free throws at the end of practice? Because that's the way I learned, right? So we would have our basketball practice. I was a basketball player. So we would have our practice, and at the end of the practice, everybody would line up at the free throw line and we would shoot. We had to shoot until we get 10 in a row, or there was some other punishment, right? Um, and so when I first started teaching, I would ask, students, is that how you did your free throws? Like, did you do them at the very end of practice, which isn't variability practice, not contextual interference, right? When you group everything at the very, very end of the practice, that's not good. Um, and I would say, half of them would say, yeah, that's how we did it. And other people would say, no, they would be interspersed throughout the practice. So some coaches knew about it, but not all of them. And as I've asked over time, more and more students say, "Oh no, we don't do that anymore." So it is getting out there. I think, there are a lot of podcasts and blogs and things where that science is being translated to for the layperson. And so I think some of it is getting out, and I think coaching textbooks are starting to pull that kind of information in. They're relying a little bit more on science, doing a little bit more evidence-based practice. That's kind of a medical term where, we've got the evidence, let's use it in practice. I think that is sort of getting out a little more.
I have one more question because apparently I've been downgraded to 40 minutes of Zoom. So
Okay.
before I can do something about that, we'll have to wrap it up. You mentioned our culture being highly sedentary.
hmm
I have heard that sitting in a chair, which I'm doing right now, and it looks like you are too, is
hmm
awful.
It is.
I have been to Asia and seen people squatting on the street.
Mm.
And when I can squat if my knees are 40 feet apart from each other, but the way that I've seen in Asia, knees are together and people are squatting, which I gather is the right way to sit. Can you give a little 5 minute disquisition as we wrap up on maybe on sitting and what we should be doing with our bodies instead to maximize our health?
Yeah. Sitting for long periods of time. I mean, it's definitely a necessary evil for a lot of the jobs that we're in, right? We're in front of computers. But what I've done in my office is I have a standing desk, and I actually have a treadmill that I have under my desk. And I do try to get up and, every hour, if you can get up and walk around the halls in your building, or get up and spend 15 minutes walking on that treadmill, or even just standing, right? All of those things are going to be better. It's this prolonged sitting that is really, really bad for us. It's bad for our heart, right? It's bad for our joints. We tend to have very bad posture when we're doing that. So bad for our backs. It's just bad in general. And so we definitely want to be taking those standing breaks, right? In the same way we talked about breaks during practice sessions, we've got to have breaks from the sitting. And there's some evidence that actually sitting it's kind of counter all of the physical activity that a lot of people try to get in. So people might go for a run for half an hour, and think, oh, well, I got my physical activity in. But if you're sitting the rest of the day, that's actually not good, right? It might be worse, right? So you should really try to build in those standing breaks, and, even get a little bit of walking in every hour.
Great. Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for talking to me about all of this stuff. And maybe we can all become healthier by becoming more active and more physical and better learners physically.
Yeah, hope so.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.